Okay, guys. So here we are, lecture number 3, which is on. We're moving away now from ancient Greece. For many of you, maybe that's a blessing, and we're moving to the final cultural ancient world period that we're going to look at, which is ancient Rome. So, just to sort of reiterate, you remember how I've been sort of talking about the ways you can think about these three different ancient worlds kind of in is like a tagline. The ancient Hebrews are all about monotheism, morality, religion, God, the transcendent. The ancient Greeks, they're all about the downward movement, the world, the human, the polis, the community, the people, culture, humanities, which is why I spent a lot of time on them because there's a lot of different strands with ancient Greece, philosophy, learning, critical thinking. With ancient Rome, as we move westward, actually, I don't know if you noticed, we went from the Middle East with the Hebrews. Now we moved then to ancient Greece, which is a little more further westward. Now we pop over the Adriatic and into the Mediterranean, into Italy with ancient Rome. For the ancient Romans, the taglines to think of are law and order, government, nation building, civilization, empire. When we think of the Romans, we really think of, in many ways, the idea of patriotism. We think of the idea of what it means to not just build, you know, um, like with the Greeks, city states, which is what they were made of. For the Romans, it's how do you create, there was no word for this at the time, but nation, something that is going to be big and last for a long period. And we'll get to it in a moment. The Romans created the greatest empire on the face of the planet, guys. No greater empire before Rome, and there has not been one since. In fact, the empire itself, run by um, dictators, Caesars essentially, lasted for a good 600 or so years. But if you want to add the Roman Republic onto the empire, Rome lasted for a good 1,000 years. I mean, a tremendous empire. At its height, guys, the Roman Empire itself encompassed all of the known world. And what I mean by the known world is, up until only like 400 or 500 years ago, we didn't know all of the rest of the globe. The known world at that time was, all of Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East, England, Ireland, all under the auspices of Rome at the time. If I had a map here, I'd show you what a vast area the Roman Empire was at its height. And in the big long lecture, a couple of the long lectures I gave you guys online, you can see I gave a couple of maps that it just encompasses everything we know of as the Western world, which means that the Roman Empire itself really is, and it's why I do it last, it's really where Europe ends up coming from. There's a continuum from Rome, the fall of Rome around 490, 500 AD, and the birth of Europe, which leads to us. We're very much, in a lot of ways, a product of the Roman Empire. So much goes back to Rome, the way we understand things, particularly law and government. For the Romans, the law was of utmost importance. Having a judicial system, having a legal system, everything you think of about what you hate about lawyers or the kind of bureaucracy of law comes straight from Rome. I mean, back then, there was like a whole thousands of bureaucrats taking care of the tons of paperwork involved with the law in the Roman Empire. But they established the whole idea of a justice system. They established the whole idea of trial by jury of your peers, and that everybody is equal under the eyes of the law, even a Caesar. Didn't quite always work out that way, but still, the whole idea was there. That you could have, if you were the defendant, you could have a lawyer to help defend you. Tons of lawyers in Rome. St. Augustine was a lawyer here and there by himself, actually. Which, by the way, when we get next week to St. Augustine, he was very much a member of the Roman Empire. He was what was called a rhetorician, a speech maker in the Roman Empire, and he wrote speeches for a couple emperors in his time before he had his big conversion. So, a massive legal system. That legal system they created is essentially the one we use today. We basically derive our legal system from ancient Rome. That famous statue of the scales of justice that are in a lot of courthouses with blind justice, that's a Roman statue. If you've noticed, courthouses like superior courthouses and county courthouses and even town courts are designed to look like Roman architecture and Roman crypts with the columns and it's supposed to emulate Rome. Back in the past, the courtroom itself was designed to look like imperial Rome, which is why people used to wear wigs who were in courtrooms. England, they still actually do that. It's supposed to emulate kind of the majesty of the Roman Empire with the notion of trial by jury, the sort of somberness and the sacredness really of such a legal system. And so we have them to thank for that. But we also have the Romans to thank for, even though they became an empire built upon autocracy, they did create essentially the government we use today. Now, theirs was not a democracy like ours, although the republic was pretty close to it. But they created this notion of there being a bicameral government of separate and equal branches of power. For instance, we have what's called the Senate chamber. We have our bicameral houses of government in Washington, the representatives and the senators. We got that right from Rome. Rome had a body of what were called senators. These were very well established, smart men who either grew into or were elected into positions where they were the legislators. Even during the time of the empire with the Caesars, the autocrats, they still wrote the laws and made decisions while the Caesar could puff up and be his and sort of be the spectacle power kind of idea. That notion of the Roman senators who write the laws maintained throughout. Before the empire, during what's called the Roman Republic, they did have a pretty close system like we have today. We have what's called, by the way, in America, we emulated off of Rome, is our government is known as a republic. We're known as a liberal democratic republic. And that's because power is vested in representatives or a council or an assembly of people who write the laws for us. And it's based upon, in many ways, kind of a constitutional organization with things. You might remember if you learned in grammar school, because they always would teach, and they should teach the Roman Empire because it's so important, kind of the differences between the republic that went from up until 44 BC and the empire that then happened 600 years beyond that. The differences between what's better, what's worse kind of idea. The differences aren't that big. I mean, the Roman Empire, which we'll talk about in a moment, occurred because of Julius Caesar, who sort of got rid of the notion of republic and made himself leader for life, essentially. That's the big difference, is the notion of not swapping out leaders and electing them, but having like what's called an autocrat who just has that position until either they're killed or they die kind of idea. But like I said, even in the empire, they maintained a kind of pseudo republic because the senators still wrote the laws. They still had a legal system. They still had justice done through a process. It wasn't just through fiat, except in times of like Nero and stuff. There was always the threat, and it would happen where an emperor would abolish the Senate, but it never worked, and they would come back and it would still be in charge, kind of idea. So Rome, for those reasons, is hugely significant. The reason we have we consider ourselves as a civilized people to be governed not by people but by laws is because of Rome. All of the ideas of justice, of everybody has their day in court kind of notion comes from Rome, as does their notion of government. Also, one of the other things that Rome creates is a gigantic martial society. One of the reasons we'll talk about this, that Rome was able to expand to become the hugest empire on the face of the planet at its height, was the development of a gigantic military culture. Through great stretches of Rome's history, if you are a guy, you were required to be in the military for a certain period, which always would ensure a pretty large military. But even without the requirement, a majority of people born as males would find their occupation in some military capacity. And they developed essentially the whole hierarchy and system of a military that we have today. They developed the notion of a general and majors, lieutenants and infantrymen. They created at that time what they would be considered a modern kind of army. A couple other things that they contributed greatly to our culture is essentially the whole notion of infrastructure. At its height, the city of Rome and then its outskirts, and its many areas, going beyond the city itself of Rome. But like the city of Rome itself, guys, at its height, we there's old maps of Rome and pictures, not photos obviously, but renditions and drawings of Rome that show just it was a metropolis. They developed roads, highways, bridges, aqueducts, sewer systems. Guys, Rome had a huge belief in public health, the first public health and governmental run public health began in Rome because they thoroughly believed that we needed public health for the health of the civilization. If people are getting sick and we don't have any maintenance of hygiene and health in the empire, they rightfully understood the empire could collapse. And therefore they did have sewer systems, for they had toilets, they had, running water. By the way, when Rome collapses, these are things like public health and sewer systems and stuff like that disappear. I don't know if you guys know, but we'll get to that next week. But in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, for a good 1,000 years, there's no more public health and sewer systems or running water. That doesn't come back until the great inventions of sewers and waterworks that occur in the 1800s, which is only 150, 200 years ago, where public health becomes something important. So Rome, a pretty modern ancient civilization before things went barbaric again in the Middle Ages until it returns to kind of our modern times. Um, these things, there are most homes had they would consider air conditioning at the time. They used architecture that would create convection, to create the flow of air. But in the cold months, like in the winter, they had indoor heating. They would heat rocks in the wealthier people's homes that would create warm water so that it would rise and create warmth. But even if you weren't wealthy, you could tap into the running hot water springs that they would bring through the aqueducts to help heat up underneath the homes. Really pretty amazing. And there's still ruins, that show a lot of this stuff from ancient Rome. There's huge, of course, there's a huge scholarly wing that studies the classics in Rome and the history of Rome. And I find the whole history fascinating. And if any of you guys do at all, I highly recommend reading anything by Mary Beard. She's written some of the most readable, brilliant woman from Harvard, but has written some of the most readable histories of Rome, like of the empire, of what it was like to live in Rome. Um, what the everyday life of just the average person would be in Rome, which wasn't that bad, by the way, in the Roman Empire to live. Movies always like to depict the more dark periods or the wars and stuff, and certainly a lot of battles because Rome was always on either the offense or the defense. But for the most part, if you were just a regular person, life was pretty good in Rome. It was a pretty stable, particularly in what's called the Pax Romana, the peace period of Rome, which ran from around 80 AD up until the beginning of the collapse of Rome in 300 AD. Nothing much happened. When we get to it, like when we talk about Christianity and the rise of it, it was the most tolerant empire in many ways because honestly, Rome was a secular culture. They didn't care what you believed in, what religion you worshiped. They conquered so many people. They had hundreds, if not thousands, of different cultures, many different religions and beliefs, and people talking in many different languages. Rome didn't care. Tolerant of all that. The only thing they cared about when you were part of the Roman Empire, the only thing they cared about is that you obey the laws, you honor the Caesar, and you pay your taxes or your grain, either way. Taxes, grain, or both, kind of a deal. That's it. That's all I care about. You go and work. You could go worship your cat. You could go worship the sun gods, or do whatever you want, as long as you abide by the law in Rome, kind of idea. So, kind of peaceful empire on that level too. So, let's back up about Rome, and I want to talk about like how Rome developed in the empire. What makes the people of Rome, the early settlers of Rome, different from the Greeks and the Hebrews? Because obviously Rome is different. They expanded to the point that they ruled pretty much the known world. Whereas ancient Greece, sure, they had a powerful civilization, and under Alexandria the Great, who we didn't cover, would taken too much time, created a pretty huge empire themselves. Nothing near Rome. For the most part, Greece was focused on separate city-states like Athens, and their concern generally was more studious, learning, doing, building, developing, not expanding so much, kind of idea. Rome, though, had a different kind of spirit. The settler, the farmers, the sheep herders, those who settled in the peninsula of Italy, sort of a way I can put it is, and we're talking hundreds of years BC, well before the empire, the agricultural people who settled in that peninsula of Italy, one of the ways you could think about it is they kind of built a civilization based upon stories. This happens a lot, by the way. It doesn't sound crazy when I say this. Their mythologies sort of informed their beliefs and how they developed as a people. So in many ways, they were a people that developed from narrative, the stories they told about themselves. We do this all the time as civilizations. We do in America. We have our own stories, our mythologies that we create about the Pilgrims and Columbus before that, and the Thanksgiving, the Indians, and all that. But with Rome, they really built on mythology, and that mythology had this focus on Roma, which really is a word that means the center, the home, and it's after one of their mythological gods. But the emphasis of Rome and the settlers of Rome, their emphasis was on the land, on place. Whereas the Greeks it was community, polis, learning. For them it was land and a familiarity and having a home, which meant that Rome developed over the hundreds of years into that megalopolis it became because Rome became the idea of having one place where you come from. And that if you're part of Rome, the idea of that is you always have a home. You're always connected to a place. You're always included. And this becomes, in many ways, as Rome develops and expands, becomes their biggest calling card, becomes the biggest benefit. Their philosophy of, when we conquer you, we're not going to obliterate you, we're going to invite you to become a citizen of Rome. So instead of like going out like the Persians might do in the ancient world and bash skulls and deracinate places and and either you're with us or against us, Rome had a kind of way of expanding bit by bit, not in big sweeps, but expanding northward into eventually Europe bit by bit. And yeah, they did do horrible bloody scourges and stuff, but still, they had a way of sort of saying, look, You could fight us, or you can join us and become part of the greatness that's Rome. And if you join us, you can become a Roman citizen. And that can mean all the benefits of home, all the benefits of the community, of the people, of the land that's Rome. So Mary Beard does a really good job in explaining how Rome is a place, it is an actual city that then develops outward, becomes the empire. But a better way to think of the word Rome is it's a place and an idea. And if you've ever seen movies like Gladiator or whatnot about the Roman Empire, you'll know that Rome's a place, but it's also an idea. It's like a magical, wonderful idea in the minds of people as far away as like the Germanic northern reaches of the empire, way out in the Middle East, that it doesn't matter where you are, you're connected by the idea of Rome. So one of the ways Barry Beard puts it is think of it as patriotism, nationalism, something we all can recognize that if you're part of something, you become patriotic about it. That a good way to think of Rome, Mary Beard would say, is to think in terms of how we think of the red, white, and blue or Uncle Sam. That's kind of the way the Romans sort of developed their idea or their spirit of Rome. Rome is an idea for everyone to become part of. And that's what then develops into sort of the greatness then of Rome. Okay, so that's a 20-minute lecture. I want to stop there. I'll do one more where I want to talk about the development of the empire and then at the height of the empire, how you get this little baby Jesus born in the middle of the Roman Empire. The unlikely little baby born in a manger from a poor family of poor people who becomes the great king of all. Anyhow, so that we'll talk about in the next lecture.